Hello and welcome back to the Awakening Philosophy Podcast. My name is Jed. We are in the Meno. We're on a hunt to find what is the excellence of the soul. What's the highest we can reach? What is virtue? What does it mean to be good? How do we reach success? Because excellence and virtue isn't just being good, it's being successful. And successfully reaching the best kind of goals. And what we saw last time, it also involves being able to reach the best kind of goals in the best kind of way. Virtue ain't virtue if you're not getting there virtuously. So we are building an understanding of what virtue is. It's something to do with our best goals. It's something to do with getting there successfully. It's tied to the idea of good. That's why we call it the best. Being successful in reaching our highest goals and doing it in the best way possible. Last time we saw that being aporia, being completely at a loss, is virtuous if being not at a loss, so states of mind, being certain or what we would think to be knowing, or materially having gold and silver, if you get that through an unjust way, so an idea of certainty that isn't really certain but an injustice of some kind, hint hint, philosophical midwifery, and materially acquiring gold and silver as Meno thinks is good and therefore must be a good goal and therefore tied to virtue. If you attain those things in an unjust way, through unjust means, that ain't justice. That's vice. Now we have a bunch of words tied together. We have good and bad, tied to virtue and vice. Also tied to excellence. So these are all parts of our understanding of what exactly virtue is. On the other hand, we're gaining an understanding of what virtue ain't. It's not harming people. It's not distinguishing people as bad guys because they actually seek bad things. It turns out that we have understood for ourselves, universally, truthfully, that everyone desires good things. The difference is whether or not they have been developing understanding to recognize the true good, or whether they have been led to believe something else, led to believe that the bad is actually good. That's a universal thing, so it's a principle. So, what does that mean? We have followed steps already ourselves to reach a definition. This whole text is about what's the definition of virtue. Not examples, not things we like, not quotes that support our dumb beliefs. No. What's the definition? Which means it's a principle, which means it's universally true. That means just because they look different, or they grew up in a different part of the country, or a different part of the earth, or a different part of the solar system, it don't matter. You can't delineate some people as being bad guys because they actually seek bad things. No. They have been led to believe that bad is good, just like you have been. Because every human being, by virtue of being a human being, is carrying false beliefs. That's why part of our journey is philosophical midwifery, to uncover the false beliefs that we are suffering from. So there's two reasons why you can't call people bad guys in that way. First of all, whatever you do to somebody else, if you are acting with integrity according to the principle, you need to do it to yourself. So if you think we need to genocide those people who have a different way of being to us, you genocide yourself. Because you also have been led to believe something is good when it ain't, which is the cause for whatever action you're mad about that they're doing. Also, it can't be virtuous because how the heck does killing someone or shooting someone or beating them up or putting them in jail or siphoning away their wealth or bombing their family, how does that help them go from belief to understanding and recognition? It doesn't. So we're already learning that virtue can't involve doing harm in that way. Also, doing harm doesn't make you more virtuous, as we've seen. It makes you more miserable and act in a mean-spirited way. And we can see that globally on the global stage. The more badness we do to people, the more angry and, well, they become. Justifiably so. Of course, that would be understanding. Currently, that's not allowed in the public discourse. Understanding the cause for people trying to fight back against the oppression, against the bad things they're doing. Nevertheless, we are not bound by that kind of ignorance. We can reflect on ourselves and understand, when are we being bad to ourselves? When are we not reflecting with understanding on causes? When are we putting ourselves down? When do we think we're bad? If you're thinking you're bad, we have seen for ourselves that ain't true. You may be carrying a false belief, in which case, how do we change our minds? That's what we're asking. That's one of the big questions. Can virtue be taught? In other words, can we change our minds through some sort of education? Does Meno change his mind? And if he doesn't, can we anyway? So that's the big one. So also we are understanding more about how do we define something. Already we have, you can't point to examples of things because that's making one many. What's a dog? That's a dog, and that's a dog, and that's a dog, and that's a dog. That's not a definition. What's virtue? When a slave does that, when a child does that, when a woman does that in the kitchen, when a man does that in politics, says Meno. That's not a definition. And part of the tragedy of his education and ours right now, as true 2,500 years ago as it is today, is we're not taught to actually define things. So we get stuck in just pointing to things we happen to have beliefs telling us we like or don't like. So what do? We fight stupidly. What's YouTube full of? Stupid people, uneducated people in this way, people who can't go to definitions and principles, pointing to things they like, pointing to things they don't like, in an argument or a debate with someone who happens to be led to different beliefs and therefore different likes and dislikes. That's stupid and pointless and annoying to watch, but also doesn't help anyone. Doesn't help any understanding, doesn't help us solve the cause of our problems and disconnection, and it doesn't help us use a freedom from problems to actually find the truth. Doesn't help us learn anything. It's stupid. So what's the alternative? That's what we're learning here. What we're calling the dialectic, what Socrates is calling the dialectic. Now, how do you define something? How do you get to a principle? The thing that should be universal, that we can all point to, we can all access, we can all understand, we can all recognize, therefore no need for immature, irrational, barbaric conflict within ourselves, within our relationships, and within our human species. No more need for that. Hooray! Wow. So what don't we do? Meno, so again, as we use the dialectic, we are defining what is and what isn't. You need both. So we are understanding, we're developing an understanding of what virtue is, but also what virtue ain't. What isn't virtue? Pointing to things, that's not a definition. All right, quoting poets that we happen to agree with, that's not a definition either. Meno has tried both. He quoted a poet, what we might call today quoting a religious prophet or a scripture, or maybe even you can go as far to say a self-help guru on YouTube, maybe that sells a course, quoting someone that inspired you because you happen to already agree with the beliefs. That's not a definition. Pointing to things in the physical world, examples, that's not a definition. And also last time, Meno gave us another way of not defining, using it as an adjective. Okay, so what's virtue? Oh, to do things virtuously. Again, some people think that way. What does it mean to be virtuous? Oh, to act with justice. Well, that's even worse. That's a part of virtue. Not only are you not defining it, but pointing to a hypothetical example where it happens to be being used. But not only are you doing that, but you're talking about a part of it. What's virtue? To have a part of virtue in your actions. What? What is truth? To speak truthfully sometimes. What? That's not a definition. So we're building a list of things that aren't definitions and contrasting it with what Socrates is doing. So that's neat. But we do have an understanding that virtue has to be achieved virtuously. So people who have a lot of wealth, by exploiting the capitalist system, paying their workers less, this is capitalism, extracting wealth from the workers. So every hour you work, if you're earning $10, the boss is earning $100, every hour you work, you're actually becoming poorer because money is a relative measurement. So if you worked for 100 hours hoping to afford a house, suddenly you can't afford a house. In fact, you are poorer than when you started because every hour you worked, you are making a capitalist richer. You're making your boss richer. So what's he going to do with all that money? Buy houses, buy groceries. All of a sudden, the working class can't afford groceries, can't afford a house to live in, can't afford rent, and so on and so on. Why? Because capitalism is defined by being an unjust, exploiting people as much as you can for personal profit. So if our understanding of virtue is achieving things that you think are good, we're not even asking whether or not gold and silver or billions of dollars is good or not. Without even asking that question, we are addressing how it is achieved. So if your wealth comes from capitalism, you are actually unjust. By definition. Now people would say, well, we are within that system. So don't blame the individual. That's a different argument. That's a tricky one. Nevertheless, we can confidently say the system itself is unjust. So, in the same way we fought Nazis and fascism, we need to also fight the injustice of capitalism. Or maybe fight isn't the wrong word. Use our understanding to come to the conclusion that Socrates helped us come to, realize it's unjust. Why? Because the way in which people achieve their wealth is, by definition, unjust. It's exploitative in nature. So therefore, whatever goodness you gain from capitalism isn't actually goodness at all. You can't get virtue through vice means. That's what we saw last time. So we're learning more about what virtue isn't, which is for you to put into your side of your dialectic. So one of our questions is, can you teach virtue? Or here's an alternative that we've been playing with, an hypothesis we're carrying. Maybe it can't be taught, it's something you learn. In other words, you have to do it. You listening to this podcast, I'm talking to you right now. You have to do it. Meaning, all of those things we've just listed, elements of what virtue is, elements of what virtue isn't, elements of what defining is, and if defining's attached to understanding, we can say elements to what understanding is, and also in column B, elements to what understanding and definition isn't. You put them into the two columns, and then you go through the process of thinking about it, reflecting upon it, wondering about it, and using your highest understanding to organize those columns. That's the dialectic. That's our method. That's what Socrates is doing. And if we look at what's involved in that process, well, you'll be focused on it. A single-minded focus on something. Interesting. You've taken all of your whims, desires, things that could pull you in this way and that, and you've separated from them, at least for an amount of time, to be singularly focused on your tables of terms you've collected. By the way, the collecting of those terms through this reading, repetition, and reflection is called philomathesis, a step leading to philosophy, according to the Phaedo. So you're single-mindedly focused. That's an interesting state of being. And you are carrying a question. How do I understand these terms? How do I organize these terms? Which column is it in terms of what virtue is column A, what virtue ain't column B? What understanding and definition is column A, what it ain't column B? You're carrying a question. And so which category is it in? That's a question. How do I organize it? That's a question. Carrying a question is another interesting state of being. Now, what state of mind does putting a question, having a question, being on a quest put you in? Now, the third element we've been talking about is rearranging or organizing the terms into a certain coherent structure, according to a certain paradigm, a paradigm that Socrates has said he's already given us. And yesterday he referred back to the paradigm again, paradigmata in the Greek, which is a kind of model or standard, or blueprints, you could even say. But paradigm is higher because it can be in the realm of being, where the blueprints of a house don't necessarily have to be an eternal pattern in the realm of being. So, interesting set of things. What have we got? A single-minded focus while carrying a question, putting us in a state of curiosity, open-mindedness, and using the highest level of our understanding we have so far developed, our highest level of logos. That's the dialectic. Isn't that interesting? Now, if you take any one of those aspects individually, you'll be able to think about them and say, single-minded focus. You mean like when I'm told to stare at a candle for 20 minutes each morning? You mean like when I have to count my breath, count to 10 along with my breath for half an hour every morning and night? You mean when I'm standing in those yoga poses, single-mindedly focused on downward dog? You'll be able to find that there are a litany of yogas or spiritual methods. Yoga means spiritual method. Yogas or meditative practices focused on this principle of a single-minded focus, sustained single-minded focus. But then you can say, well, hang on a second, what about that other aspect we're doing? We're not just single-mindedly focused on our work that we've just been talking about. We are wondering and open-minded and curious because we have a question. Equally so, you'll find spiritual traditions or meditations or yogas based on that. Koans most famously. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That kind of thing. Now, what makes what we're doing special and different and maybe more paradigmatic of a higher order, or the standard, is we are also introducing that third element that all other spiritual traditions more or less lack. The logos. Single-minded focus of our soul in a certain state of mind in which we're doing those actions, using our understanding. You might recognize that from the Republic as the three aspects of our soul. Now, I can leave you to wonder about that. But so we're not neglecting our understanding. So famously, you might have already recognized that many of these yogas fear their own understanding, fear the logos, and therefore reject the logos. Understanding is bad. Understanding is a sickness. Let your thoughts go like clouds, that kind of thing. Why? Why embrace and try and have the ideal of the other aspects of our soul? Our desiring part, which can be hectic and fragmented if you desire a lot of different things, but we're bringing into a oneness, bringing into a singular focus. Why seek the excellence or virtue of that? And also, hey, how do we do things in the word? How do we move outwardly, the outwardly moving aspect of our soul? Our desire is an inward thing, seeking things for us. And the other part of our soul moves us outwardly. In what state of mind? Do you want to do it with a kind of certainty that Meno had when he thinks he knows things? How did he outwardly move in the world? Confidently and certainly declaring he knows things he doesn't. What we might call being an alpha, or oftentimes being an expert in the current society we are in. Faking it. Confidently and maybe, hey, often attached to anger. Angrily, confidently asserting your stupid beliefs as though they're truths. Like Meno? Or are we doing something that is pretty much the opposite? What did Socrates say about his knowledge of virtue? He said, I don't know virtue. We don't know. But let's have some questions about virtue. So what's the opposite of certainty? That's how we're moving outwardly. What's the opposite of anger? That's how we're moving outwardly. So, what are we finding? We're finding the highest or the excellence, or what we could call the virtue of that aspect of our soul in how we do it. So, the excellence of our seeking part of our soul, the virtue of our seeking part, a single-minded seeking, specifically on a good goal. So you're not fragmented, you're not full of tangents or distractions or negative self-talk or blocks. You're single-mindedly focused. An aspect of meditation. Outwardly moving with the excellence of the outward moving part of the soul. But if you're familiar with the Republic, you'll recognize there are three parts of our soul. There's that which desires inwardly. There's that which moves us to do things, to do actions in the world, the outward moving part of our soul. And for both of them, there needs to be a part of your soul, your psyche, your mind that plans. What sandwich do I desire? What activity do I want to do today? And how do I plan the steps to reaching it? How do I set a goal with my planning and thinking? How do I organize the parts, the steps to reach that goal? And how do I judge whether or not the goal and those steps are actually the best that I can do? In other words, do I want to see a movie or do I want to go and have coffee with my friend? Which is the better goal? Which is the more good goal? And in terms of the steps, how can I better reach my friend? Am I going to jog there? Am I going to take the car there? Am I going to take the bus there? Am I going to, and judge, as we saw last time, how can we judge whether or not those steps are actually good? Am I going to pull out a gun and hijack someone and steal their car like on Grand Theft Auto? No, because even though I might have judged the goal as virtue, excellent, most good, the step of carjacking someone, like in that video game, is actually bad. And therefore, I can't say I'm doing virtue if the way I get there is through vice. That's what we saw last time. So all of this is the reasoning part of our soul, which is actually called the logos in the ancient Greek, the logos part of our soul. So what's the excellence of reasoning? Well, many Eastern spirituality people, everyone who's not into philosophy would say, yes, single-minded focus, that's the excellence. We embrace that in our yoga. And maybe even a kind of non-angry, non-certain, opposite of those state of being. Maybe to do with having a question or a koan. Yes, that's important. But that other part of our soul, it's sickness. Now, we recognize that in philosophy as something that's anti-logos, and then vice. So even if they're able to reach certain goals that are good in their meditation, maybe they've had certain experiences, we would say, hang on a second, by rejecting perhaps the highest part of the soul, the most important part of the soul, your reason and logos, you've reached whatever spiritual virtue you've got in an unvirtuous way. Sorry to break it to you, pal. According to what we can see for ourselves and recognize for ourselves in the Meno, you're actually developing vice. Oh. And of course they would say, how dare you? I've been meditating in this way for 40 years. You have no idea how many waterfalls I've sat under. And my daddy was a Taoist guru, and my mother was a Sufi mystic, and how dare you challenge my opinion about them as being flawless, and so on and so on. Why? Well, because that's how people react to things that challenge their dearly held beliefs if they are not familiar with the logos and philosophical midwifery. In other words, people can be irrationally and immaturely defending the very things that cause their problems, which is a fascinating thing to see about humanity, and it's something we have to acknowledge. And we can also wonder, is Meno like that? Is Meno willing to change his mind, or is he going to be blindly loyal to his dumb beliefs, even having been shown by the smartest guy ever, probably, Socrates, even being shown that his false beliefs and his allegiance to his teacher and family and partner are causing, which feeds into his false beliefs. Even if Socrates shows him that these are harmful and false, is he going to stay loyal to them anyway? It's a question. And if he does, can we take that as a model for what we shouldn't do? That's what we've been talking about today. Meno is giving us examples of how not to understand, how not to define. Equally so, could we put in those tables which we talked about, can you put Meno in one of those categories of how do we not define and understand? And then put Socrates in the other one. If that's the case, can we ask the question, could we equally do that for Meno for our other table? What's our other table? Virtue. Meno is definitely giving us examples of what's not virtue. Getting gold and silver in an unjust way, that was one of them. Harming enemies, one of them. Meno himself, will he be a personification of what virtue ain't? Side B. If he doesn't change his mind, if he stays blindly loyal to the beliefs that are causing him harm. And we know that beliefs cause harm because that's something we recognize. That recognition and understanding allows us to see the truth, that bad things are bad, whereas beliefs can cause us to believe otherwise. Beliefs don't have to be true. Everyone knows that. And so do we now. Now, logos. So we will say to these, maybe we won't say it very loudly, or maybe we'll be very selective in who we tell, or maybe we won't tell them, we'll invite them to a reflection on this dialogue so they can see it for themselves. Whatever the case is of how we do it, the goal would be to help them to recognize that even if they are seeking the excellence of those two parts of their soul while seeking meaningful goals in their spiritual quest for enlightenment, if they are neglecting that part of the soul, the reason part of the soul, then they may be doing it in a way that's going to create problems. We famously talk on this channel about the pervy sage. Many animes have as the teacher of the lead character a sage, but they always seem to have a problem. Huge problem. The drunken master or the pervy sage or the angry whatever. So, what So that we could put that as examples of what virtue ain't, and we can ask the question, what's the opposite? What if we don't neglect that part of our soul, the reasoning part of the soul, and ask, what is the excellence of setting a high goal, judging whether or not something is good or not, the steps, pulling out the right parts that we would follow to reach the goal, organizing those steps in the most excellent possible way. In other words, what's the excellence or virtue of logos? And if we're doing that, along with the single-minded focus on this activity which we've just set up for ourselves today, and in the state of mind in which we are outwardly doing it, the opposite of certainty and anger, then we would be embracing the excellence of all three parts of our soul, and therefore, whatever we do, whether we succeed or not, whether we end up at a loss or successful, we have still been cultivating virtue. So in other words, you don't have to get the tables correct. You just have to be doing it in this way, which is fascinating, which maybe helps us shed light on why Socrates says, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter whether he knows or not. Maybe the way in which he seeks the goal is far more important. So, what would be the excellence of the logos? What would be the best way in which we judge things, in which we organize the parts, and make sure even the parts are the best? Hasn't that been what Socrates has been doing? Hasn't Socrates been judging the goal of excellence all the way through? And when Meno gave his definition that we're working on now, to desire beautiful things and be able to get them, have we been breaking that down into parts, division? And have we been judging with reason each of those parts against a standard of goodness, truth, excellence, and beauty? In other words, hasn't Socrates been demonstrating what that excellence of reason might be that we need to integrate in our way of being? And by the way, if this is an activity that Socrates is always in, we don't have to say meditation is something irrational and against the logos that we have to pick out 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes at night to do. Whether we're stretching or counting our breaths or watching a candle or repeating a prayer or a mantra or contemplating a koan. In other words, if we recognize that there is this part of the soul that's rational, that can be done at all times, because everything involves some kind of thinking, some kind of planning, some kind of goal, some sort of reflection, some sort of judgment. And if our question is, well, how do we use our reasoning or logos the best? Then meditation isn't a thing separate from being alive. In other words, every moment we will be having all of the conditions, not cherry picking this and that while actually being unjust because we're ignoring other parts and therefore our method isn't great, isn't the best. But every moment will be a walking meditation. Having those conditions that are formally conditions for meditation, single-minded focus, a certain non-angry, non-certain state of mind, but also focus on our highest goal with the highest part, organizing all the parts together into a coherent whole. In other words, there's no difference between meditation and philosophy, or meditation and thinking, or meditation and being an alive human being with a soul or mind. In other words, we can do what is called in the Republic, doing your highest and intended purpose at all times, in private for that 30 minutes that you put aside, but also in public and in all your relationships, business and private relationships. This is how Socrates described the virtue of justice, the virtue that we have been reading again and again in this text. So that definition comes from book 3 or 4 of the Republic, which we need. So the Meno is tied to the Republic. And again, we'll get into the Republic soon on this channel. So look for that definition if you want to pull out that, because we're using it in the Meno. But how can we be just at all times? As we've seen, justice isn't sometimes kicking a puppy, but then sometimes petting a puppy. Always pet the puppy, otherwise it ain't justice. And if it's not just having money, because money's great, if you think, I mean, let's ignore whether or not that is the best goal. But whatever the goal is, you can't take time off and gain that wealth through an unjust means, because that's not justice. That's not virtue. In other words, it's something that we have to be able to do at all times. So it can't just be half an hour in the morning and half an hour at the night. It has to be an all times kind of thing for us to have justice, according to what we've been understanding for ourselves. Can't happen in the other traditions that reject the logos, reject our thinking. Why? Well, we can ask that question, why they grew up in a tradition that rejects thinking, but how many traditions do really? How many people say, oh, just believe us, just have faith? Don't understand. It's where we are as a species, except for Socrates, who came and suggested something different. Gave us what we need to understand. Oh, people don't actually seek bad things. They've been led to believe. We are a part of human development characterized by a loyalty and a desire for, or an urge for, belief that has to be replaced with a higher desire for understanding. That's the logos. So, as you are collecting these terms, putting them into the two columns of your tables, what is virtue and what is definition? You are engaging in something that is a single-minded focus in a certain state of mind. That's the opposite of anger and certainty, while using the highest part, or the excellence or the virtue of your reasoning part to do that, because the way you are organizing it is according to the paradigm Socrates has given us. Ironically, a paradigm attached to virtue, a paradigm needed for definition. So arranging these two tables, you are doing definition while also demonstrating it. You are defining using the paradigm if you're using the dialectic to organize those terms. And you are doing a column on virtue while being virtuous if you are having a single-minded focus with that certain state of mind that you are outwardly moving in, and using the dialectic. In other words, you are defining and demonstrating at the same time, which is the dialectic, definition and demonstration. Applied to the divisions, the two different columns, and after you do so, you'll be able to reflect on what you've seen to have improved your understanding of both. That's the four categories of the dialectic. Isn't that amazing? So you'll be operating in a virtuous way using the dialectic on multiple levels, as the paradigm of spirit of yoga and meditation, as the paradigm of understanding, as the paradigm of reading, as the paradigm of virtue, as the paradigm of the virtue of reasoning, the virtue of logos, that part of the soul, while also defining and demonstrating to do all five of those things, which is itself dialectic, which is itself the paradigm of all those five things. That's called ousia, wrapping around upon yourself. So you could say you are singly unified in everything you're doing by doing those things. Isn't that amazing? So if someone says to you, oh, do you meditate? Oh, yeah. Every single moment's a meditation. And if you think that otherwise, then you might be carrying a false belief that's preventing you from actually reaching the excellence of soul, which is the whole purpose of meditation. What? Oh yeah, if you're not incorporating your understanding, the dialectic, then you might think you're reaching virtue, but if you're getting there in a less than virtuous way, got bad news for you, buddy. Good news for you, buddy, if you're willing to learn. But learning is something that involves reasoning. So they should jump at the chance to learn something new. If they don't and say, how dare you challenge me, or how dare you call into question my personal meditation, they are literally demonstrating why it's not virtue to reject the logos in your meditation. Those who think meditation is not involving understanding and logos stop themselves from the logos, stop themselves from learning. If Socrates came along and said, hey, by the way, you're wrong, they'll say, screw you, Socrates. And they'll be one of those people who vote for his execution, which is what happened in his life. Demonstrating what you have just defined, that meditation without dialectic in the logos is going to harm you. It's actually vice. Unless you're actually using all three parts of your soul in excellence, you're not reaching the excellence of the spirit, which is the point of yoga, to reach being, non-physical experience of reality and self. And by the way, if you haven't got there through the logos, when you do have that enlightenment experience, you might mistake that for the self. Wow, I saw myself. Really? Was it yourself? Or can you organize your experience through the dialectic that has been part of your meditation while carrying a question which has been part of your meditation? Be focused on that activity of asking a question about causes, which is a part of the dialectic. So there's your single-minded. Single-mindedly have a question about the cause of even that experience, allowing you to go beyond being to the self. If not, you can be stuck at a level of being, which is a joke that Pierre Grimes would often make. What a problem to be stuck at the level of bliss, to be stuck at the level of beauty itself, to be stuck at the experience of ultimate reality, to be stuck on enlightenment. I mean, it is a huge problem. The joke is, it's one of the best, or it's the best experience you can have. So a good class of problems in that sense. But unless your meditation, who has as a goal enlightenment, has the excellence of that part of your soul, reasoning, you might reach there, you might falsely identify it with yourself and get stuck there and not reach your destiny, which is, of course, vice. Problem. You're stuck. And if anyone comes along and says, hey, let's reflect on that experience, you might flip out. How dare you challenge my belief? Or I can't take in understanding because my tradition, my Buddhist tradition, my Taoist tradition, my Muslim tradition, my Christian tradition, my Jewish tradition, you name it, is based on belief. That's what faith means. We, like Meno, we quote poets we like. They're the prophets. Like Meno, we point to people we are familiar with and unfamiliar with, call one good guys, call one enemies, and think it's good to genocide one group. That's the Crusades. Doesn't even have to be religious. That's the Nazis. That's what's happening to the Palestinians. So, if you come along and say, hey, by the way, let's improve your understanding, which is the dialectic. Every dialectic you do, you go back to the start, and you have learnt a little bit more, giving you what you need to do another dialectic. So you're always improving. It's a relationship of growth. That's the dialectic. If you come along and say, let's improve on what you're doing, and they say, no, get out of here. One of the reasons can be because their tradition wasn't based on the logos. Meaning, if you come along and say, let's add this, they'll say, hang on a second, how do I know what to add and what to remove? I don't understand enlightenment. That hasn't been the game. We believe the prophets or the preachers or the imams or you name it. The Vedic scriptures, we believe that. We have devotion to that. Devotion, oh, that's the big part, loving devotion, right? So how do I use understanding to define what parts are and judge the parts as being good and serving the whole or needing to be improved? I can't. That hasn't been my tradition. When I do my meditation, I try and let go of thoughts. So therefore, if someone comes along and say there's a problem, what do we say? I don't care, or I'll fight you, or I'll get some money from capitalism and all that stuff and genocide you, blow up your family, which is vice. Even at the small levels, when they say, well, that's just your belief, have a good day, namaste, that's still vice. They are still preventing themselves from development. And if they are unfortunate enough to have an enlightenment experience, they can get even more stuck there. I have seen the face of God, and no one can convince me otherwise. That's a huge problem. Which is, and by the way, the greater the experience of being you have without, or metaphysics, without the logos, the more loyal you can become to those false beliefs. The more fervent a Christian crusader as you murder all the non-Christians. I have seen the face of Jesus. Nothing can prove me otherwise. I'm going to be a religious fundamentalist, whatever. Martyr. Vice. This is vice. So what was the cause of vice? That's what we saw last time. Even if you have what could be a noble goal, an excellent goal, enlightenment, and even if you're using the excellence of this part of your soul, desire, which can be fragmented because you've got a single-minded focus, and even if you are using the excellence of this, maybe you're not an angry, certain fundamentalist, but you have a question, you're wondering about this or that, you've got a koan. That might be the excellence of these two parts of the soul, but if you're not also including the excellence of the reason part of your soul, you are not acting with excellence, you are acting with injustice, and therefore you can't reach, and because of the principle we've understood and recognized as universally true that we did last time, you can't get justice through injustice, therefore you are not actually doing something with justice, you are not reaching vice, you are you're not reaching virtue, you're cultivating vice, by rejecting the logos in your meditation or your understanding of meditation and yoga or spirituality. And vice versa, you can say the same thing about philosophers who may love the dialectic and understanding, but neglect that state of mind, neglect that single-minded focus, neglect the fact that it's a spiritual discipline, in which case you might come along to those academics who have a lot of PhDs, like Meno, they spend a lot of money on their education. Maybe like Gorgias, they have a lot of students. They're very proud of themselves of being a great teacher and say, hey, by the way, you know that philosophy is a method of excellence of the parts of your soul, especially unified through the dialectic, so that you can reach something called being, which is a metaphysical experience, something you can only experience through the spirit, giving you an experience of knowledge called nous. Formerly, the understanding or the dialectic applied to that is called dianoia. Therefore, philosophy is fundamentally a spiritual discipline. If they look at you and say, wow, that's fantastic, I'm going to reflect on that and add that to my understanding to be more virtuous, then they're on the right path. If they say anything else, get out of here, where's your PhDs? Can you quote Kant or Hegel? Or don't you know that Socrates was dumb because he was old and evolution means everyone new is smart? If they say anything that, they're literally preventing themselves from their own development. That's vice. And if they have any influence like Gorgias over their students or patients, if they're a psychologist or whatever, they are acting unjust towards those people, demonstrating that very principle you're telling him. Philosophy is spirituality, and likewise spirituality is philosophy. They're not different. So long as you recognize all human beings seek excellence, only some have been led to believe other things, led to believe the bad is good. If you transition from belief to understanding, you can recognize for yourself, this has to be the good, this has to be true meditation, this has to be the true spiritual paradigm, it has to be the true intellectual paradigm too, because how are you going to get intellectual principles and definitions unless you are putting to being? That's something that Meno is struggling with. Necessarily, and beautifully so. And of course it has to be the same thing. Otherwise, how can you have a single-minded focus on it? If spirituality is over here and philosophy is here for 3 classes a day and meditation is over here for 30 minutes every morning and so on. You can't be doing it. It can't be virtue. In other words, you can't have justice, which is doing it at all times. Necessarily, it has to be a oneness. That's the dialectic. The excellence of reasoning that Socrates is laying out for Meno, definition and defining, that can pull together all of the other aspects that we can recognize in all other spiritual traditions into a unity, which is formally, it's the one of the purposes of the dialectic, to bring about the many things in your tables, bring it together into a unity, into a system of understanding, culminating in self to self, definition of the subject itself. So Meno can't have a definition. Of course he can't. He hasn't learned the dialectic. So if you do feel courageous and you feel like going to a temple or a mosque or an ashram or a Zen center and explaining this to people who have been led by belief to not develop the excellence of the Logos in their otherwise spiritual practices, if you feel the courage to go to those people and make this argument, let us know how you go. And in doing so, you will be demonstrating the very practice of meditation we're defining, because you'll have a single-minded focus on your subject. You will hopefully have some sort of non-angry and non-certain state of mind, some question about the person or question about where he's stuck or a question about where he's at. That's propelling your state of being as you outwardly reach him. And you'll be arranging the conversation not as a debate to own him, but the way Socrates is using the dialectic to bring him along, the way Socrates is doing Meno. So formally, officially, you will have those 3 qualities that are the excellence of the 3 parts of the soul, that are needed for excellence as a whole, to be done at all times, justice. So you will be helping him as best you can, while also helping your own soul. A walking dialectic or a walking meditation at all times. You don't have to take a 5-minute break to kick a few puppies, because meditation is only a sometimes thing, or virtue is only a sometimes thing. By the way, the virtue of understanding has to reach being, which you can only experience as nous in the spirit. So understanding is a spiritual tradition. And likewise, the spiritual way of reaching that has to be through a single-minded, unified, and you have to be understanding what you're going to be experiencing. Dialectic is the method for spirituality too. So if it's both, it's really just one, which means you can do it at all times. And of course you have to. As we said, you can't reach justice in an unjust way. You can't reach virtue through vice. You can't sometimes take a break to kick a few puppies and then pat yourself on the back and say, what a great animal rights activist you are. Isn't that neat? And you have an opportunity to take all of the terms we've pulled out in today's reflection, put it into side A and side B of the 2 tables. And we have an example from last time of a similar kind of a thing. Here we go. Now, last time we had no, I'm sorry. I was thinking about this, our last philosophical midwife. I'll bring it up. The last philosophical midwifery class we did that. We're reading the text and we recognized that our author was giving us an A and B. This is to define maturity. To be immature is inside A. To be blindly loyal to appearances. To never question sincerity and beauty, even if it lacks integrity, cowardice, a desire for beliefs instead of understanding. This is all immaturity, but also in the text, he was giving us examples of what maturity would be. Reveal yourself in a wide range of ways all the time, so that any particular example of vice or introducing pathologos will have less of an impact, because it's not a rare moment you're coming out to declare something, usually in anger if it's a pathologos. Right? Asking questions. Question the integrity of something that appears sincere and beautiful. Haven't we been doing that? Questioning what appears sincere and beautiful to many followers of Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Muslimism, Islam, you name it. They wouldn't be in it if it didn't appear sincere and beautiful. We've been talking about going down to the ashram and saying, hey, by the way, could you actually benefit your tradition by introducing the understanding, the logos? That's a maturity. So side A and side B. Today we've been talking about all of the things that we have been developing so far in, let's put it on the board. In what is virtue? We have a side A and side B. What it isn't. Now, usually we have side B as what it isn't in the dialectic, but let's put it just for fun in side A, because we're getting more of what isn't from Meno than what is. In fact, to get what is, we kind of, it seems like Socrates is wanting us to do work, so it's easy to get the what isn'ts. But also, definition. How do we come to definitions? Because definitions, which is a part of understanding. So understanding has more than just definitions, but it's a big part of it, because understand something, you need to unify it under a single term. That's a duck. All the parts are unified under a certain definition, and we put a name on that. That's a definition. It's a duck. So when you understand a duck, you look at the parts. It flies, it quacks, has a beak, likes water, likes breadcrumbs. And then take all those parts and you give it a unity and you give it a name, duck. So then you see a new duck you've never seen before, but then the child points to the duck and says, duck. It's a definition. So you are understanding. So we have side A and side B, what it is, isn't, and what it is. Now, I said that this is an activity for you guys to do, but guys and gals, but I'll get you started, because I'm just that nice of a guy. So it'd be like this, but also we would have like this. And like this. There you go. And so you can start by collecting some terms that we talked about today. What have we seen already? Well, we've seen, a big one, virtue does involve the logos and the dialectic, right? Virtue isn't a sometimes thing. To come to a right definition, you don't, let's put a different color, why not? Point to examples you like or dislike. Understanding is, well, the paradigm is a paradigm for understanding. That's called the dialectic that has to exist in being. So if your understanding isn't about being, you're kind of screwed. So if you are stuck in your physical senses, that's not understanding. That's pointing to things you like. And newsflash, you like people who are like your family. If you grew up Jewish, you're going to like Jewish people, and you're going to dislike people who are Muslim, and that makes you very easily be manipulated. Hey, aren't we the most moral army? Israeli army who is doing a genocide against people we don't like? That could be their belief. Maybe they're telling the truth when they think that they are the most moral. They are the most just and virtuous because they are genociding examples of things they don't like. Why don't they like it? It's to do with physical examples. The physical world, only the physical world only. It's not, you can't come to a definition in the physical world only. And that also means physical senses. So that might make sense of the great comedic tragedy of Meno's education, and our education, by the way. Those academic philosophers or teachers at primary school and high school and university who ain't teaching it as a meditation to reach being. And likewise, those people at the other schools, different schools, different? Many? Are we making many what should be one? By saying the academics are different than the spiritualists, the ashram is different from the college campus. Is that virtue to make many what should be one? So physical senses isn't where you're going to get a definition. Beliefs, you can be, let's put that in virtue, by the way. Virtue isn't something that is a belief, led to belief. Something that has to be recognized. So that's a start. And I don't want to do too much more because I want to give you guys something to do. Why? Because that might be virtuous. Giving you an activity that would demonstrate what we're defining as the true spiritual and academic, let's just call it one word, philosophy tradition. And maybe not philosophy, let's say philodianoia. Because dianoia is the word that means understanding directed towards being. Dianoia, the dialectic. So let's call it that. Only because philosophy is so misused and it has all this baggage. Philosophy is, most people understand what Socrates calls philodoxia, love of opinions, as philosophy. So maybe it's going to be beneficial not to use that word because it's so loaded with the opposite definition. So here, what's understanding? What it isn't is opinions, philodoxia. So we can say philodianoia instead of philosophia. Philosophy is love of wisdom. Wisdom is the virtue of that reason principle that's neglected. Wisdom is the exercise of the dialectic. Because wisdom is defined as the virtue of the logos aspect of the soul. So let's use the word philodianoia instead, because that's the love of understanding. So, neat. So this is part of reading. This is part of philodianoia or philosophy. This is the love of learning aspect. Review, repetition, remembering. That's philomethesis, and philomethesis leads into philosophy, which is the dialectic. So we are doing that philomethesis, remembering and recollecting and pulling out terms, and then going into philosophy, which is arranging all of these terms in a certain structure called the dialectic. And one of our questions is, can it be taught, or is it something you have to learn? Well, if it's something you have to learn, then it would be unjust for me to do it for you. It's okay to get you started. But now you've got enough to get started. Go through everything else you remember that you've been wondering about. See what it's like to be singularly focused for as long as you can on this activity. See if you can do it with a state of mind, unlike Meno. So that's a question. Is Meno's state of mind here or here? Is Meno able to do this or not? That's for you to decide. And use whatever you have learned from this series or from our reading about the dialectic to do that organization of the terms in these two tables. And how does it affect you? So after you do it, you've demonstrated what you defined, and you've divided it up into these two. In other words, you've done it all the time. You've done it in at least two things. That's division. You need the conclusion. Reflect on your experiences. Reflect on your state of mind. Reflect on whether or not you're successful. That's the conclusion stage of the dialectic. So let's look at it while we talk about it. Here we go. So we're doing this to come to a definition of what is understanding and definition and what is virtue. By doing the activity, we may be demonstrating that very thing we are defining. By doing it for everything we're doing in the text, or at least two tables, that's dividing it up. We're doing it as much as we can. But after you've done it, can you conclusion? Can you synthesize the experience? Can you pull out from your activity of doing those things certain themes? Was there a certain state of mind you went through? Was it frustrating? Was it uncomfortable to do this activity just because, I don't know, because that's where the podcast has led us right now? Is it weird because it feels like homework and you're getting all yucky feelings? Is it cool? That voice that says it's ick, that gives you the ick, does that have a certainty or an anger like Meno? Or is it a certain sort of open, curious state like Socrates? What was the effect for the rest of your day? Did you talk about it over coffee? Oh, I don't have a coffee here. Over coffee with your friend. In other words, reflect on the experiences and bring it together in a synthesis. And now, use that reflection, ousia, on your definition, demonstration, and division. And then bring it back, bring all of that reflection back to that first start and see, how does my reflection on all those things I experienced for myself, recognized for myself, how does that relate to my original definition of virtue and understanding or definition? Does my recollection, review, and synthesis of everything I went through in that activity and for the rest of the day, can I bring it back to the start? That's the synthesis back to the subject, back to self itself. And do I, from my own experiences, have a clearer definition of virtue, or a more evolved definition of virtue, and a clearer or more evolved or more puzzled even? Hey, to be at a loss is actually great if you're doing it following justice, with what we just read. So maybe I have a less clear definition of virtue and understanding, but there's something puzzling about it that can be exciting. I'm more at a loss. I've got more aporia. Or maybe I see it clearer. Or I've got more questions. Maybe I've come to new insights. All of it's great. All of it's aspects of virtue, so long as you're doing it virtuously. By the way, does that reflect what we saw from Socrates' dialectic on virtue? Right at the beginning, Socrates said, hey, by the way, virtue is definition, an eidos existing in being that you keep your eye on while doing the dialectic. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, or a friend having coffee, or someone walking down the street, it doesn't differ. In other words, there's not one virtue for men and women. It's the same. By the way, his next dialectic on virtue was, we could understand it as a demonstration dialectic. How does it demonstrate itself? Where's his other dialectic? Here we go. So a dialectic within demonstration section. Well, how do we define it in terms of how it functions? Managing well. With justice, which means at all times, and temperance means a single focus of all of your many aspects of your soul. So we've been talking about a desire part of our soul, our outwardly moving part of the soul, and our reasoning part of the soul. You need all of it. That's temperance. And have it all of your desires with a single focus. That's our single-minded focus. That's also temperance. So temperance applies to your desire part, but it also applies to the whole. Doing it at all times, that's justice. You can't just kick a puppy sometimes, but then go back to helping puppies. It's not, it's an all times thing. By the way, if you do it, manage well with temperance and justice, you are more likely to reach success. You are more likely to have the good of the thing you're seeking. And the thing we're seeking is virtue and understanding. And we've recognized that it's also spiritual enlightenment, which is the direct experience of the good. So if we do this, we'll have a greater success at reaching the good of the good itself. And our synthesis, by the way, this has to be a true principle in being. It's not just a belief or an opinion, or true for us but not true for the Muslims, or true for us and not true for the Christians. It's always true. Otherwise, people could not be good in the same way. People couldn't reach enlightenment in the same way. It wouldn't be a paradigm. By the way, the conclusion is, if we are doing this at all times, we are managing ourselves. Because, hey, children and elderly people don't manage the city. So how are the children going to be managing, or the slaves managing? Yourself. If we do this, we will be managing ourselves well, and we will always know we're doing it justly and never unjustly. That was a conclusion that Socrates gave us to help us on our journey. That follows his dialectic that we read at the beginning, the first 10 pages. Therefore, our hypothesis that we're working with is, it doesn't matter if after this process that we've been talking about, we come back to the beginning with a greater definition or a greater clarity, or if we end up more aporia, at a loss, uncertain, puzzled, super puzzled even, because from that dialectic we've seen, if we do this, we are managing ourselves justly. So justice isn't necessarily the success of reaching it, it's the activity. If we can also be at a loss. So, do the table in this way with the dialectic and a focus and a curious state of mind. See how it affected your day. Do it in 2 tables. Talk to your friends about it. Then at the end of all that, review, unify it into a synthesis, and take that review, that usia, self-reflection, back to your original tables, your original definition, and see if your experience of the day can shed more light or not. If it does shed more light, great. If it doesn't, great also, because you're more puzzled. That's more aporia. Both are just. And if you do this, you can be confident in knowing that you spent your day being just and not unjust. Whether or not you ended up with more insights and understanding or more puzzlement and aporia. Because what we read last time, we said, therefore, let's highlight it. Then the non-getting of gold and silver, this being at a loss. Now, it's gold and silver for the Meno, but for us it's understanding, insight, and enlightenment, or recognition of self. Not reaching it, being at a loss, is also self-virtue. When you're doing it through justice. Or when it's not just to get it. So let's go back a bit. So Meno, do you add to this providing of good things a just and pious way of doing it, or does it make no difference to you, someone who gets those things unjustly? Therefore, this way of providing, way of getting good things, is no more than being at a loss, not getting it. Of these kinds of goods, it will still be virtue, so long as it sums across through the practice of justice. It will be virtue. So in other words, whether or not you gain insight, understanding, enlightenment, or recognition of self from that analysis part, or you're completely at a loss and more puzzled than you were to begin with, either way, you have been cultivating virtue. Because your activity has been the practice of what our hypothesis of what justice is. Dialectic all the way down, it seems. Isn't that neat? Well, with that, best of providence to you. Providence is a philosophical word of luck, but actually points to the Logos being the generator of luck, helping you walk this path of Logos and dialectic. So may the Logos smile on you and your activity, and please share in the comment section of this YouTube how it went. What was your synthesis and what was your analysis? Did you gain insight and understanding, or did you end up more aporia? And then, hey, use that, add that to your definition and go through it again, leading to a new conclusion. In other words, dialectics all the way down, but dialectics all the way up. So share your insights, your understanding, or your aporia, your being completely at a loss, in the comment section on YouTube. Join the Discord if you want to be among a community of people who are also walking the journey.
I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure.
Because philosophy isn't a one-person game. It's not a solo quest. And yeah, have fun doing it today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.